For anyone who owns firearms classified under the new federal definition of assault weapons, violations can result in up to 10 years in federal prison. This is not hypothetical. This is not a partisan warning. It is reality, and it affects millions of Americans who lawfully own firearms. The unanimous decision signals a judicial consensus rarely seen in modern American history, and it redefines the boundaries of constitutional rights in ways that will echo for decades. Compliance is no longer optional, and understanding the scope of this ruling is critical for every gun owner, collector, and dealer in the United States. Before we dive deeper, make sure to stay informed. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you can follow all developments as they unfold. The assault weapons ban set to take effect in 2026 has deep roots in America's ongoing struggle to balance public safety with constitutional protections. For decades, lawmakers have grappled with how to address firearms that can cause mass casualties while respecting the Second Amendment. Previous federal bans in the 1990s, including the 1994 assault weapons ban, expired after 10 years and left significant gaps in enforcement. Lawmakers and public safety advocates argued that these gaps contributed to rising incidents of mass shootings. In response, Congress drafted the current legislation to impose stricter controls, redefine the classification of assault-style weapons, and introduce mandatory registration for firearms falling under this category. This legislation was immediately challenged in federal courts, culminating in a Supreme Court review that resulted in an unprecedented 9-0 ruling in favor of the federal government. The unanimous nature of the decision is significant. In a country often divided by partisan politics, the court's ruling signals a legal alignment across ideological lines, suggesting that the judiciary views the regulation of assault-style firearms as a matter of national importance rather than political preference. This ruling doesn't merely block or allow legislation, it actively reshapes the interpretation of the Second Amendment, establishing a legal precedent that could influence firearm regulation for decades. Law-abiding citizens, gun collectors, and licensed dealers now face a landscape where ignorance is not a defense, and non-compliance carries criminal consequences. Key players in this process include Congress, which drafted and passed the legislation with bipartisan support, citing escalating mass shootings and concerns over public safety. Several advocacy groups and individual states challenged the law, arguing it violated constitutional rights. The Supreme Court, however, sided with the federal government in a decisive and unanimous judgment. Federal authorities, legal analysts, and law enforcement agencies have recognized the ruling as a pivotal shift in power. State-level resistance may continue, but federal enforcement is now legally binding and will take precedence over conflicting state laws. This represents a realignment of power, signaling that the federal government has the final say on this issue and that the courts are willing to enforce broad regulatory authority over firearms classified as assault-style. Understanding the practical implications is crucial. The ruling establishes clear rules and consequences. First, firearms classified as assault-style are now prohibited unless registered under the new federal system. Sale, transfer, or possession without registration is considered a federal crime. Violators face penalties including up to 10 years in prison, substantial fines, and permanent revocation of firearm rights. Registration is mandatory, and failure to comply triggers immediate legal consequences. Law-abiding gun owners must examine their entire arsenal, consult with legal experts, and ensure compliance with the new standards. Federal authorities have confirmed that enforcement will be rigorous, and legal exemptions are narrowly defined. To illustrate the impact, consider the case of a licensed firearm collector in Texas who owns multiple semi-automatic rifles. Under the new legislation, if any of these rifles meet the federal definition of an assault weapon and are not registered, the collector faces up to 10 years in prison, fines, and permanent loss of firearm rights. Gun stores across multiple states are also affected. Inventory must be reviewed, reclassified, and in some cases, surrendered. Failure to comply exposes business owners to criminal prosecution. These are not hypothetical scenarios. Federal prosecutors and law enforcement agencies are already preparing for enforcement operations beginning in 2026. This is a nationwide shift in legal responsibilities for every individual and business involved with firearms. Critics of the law have raised multiple arguments. Some assert that it infringes upon constitutional rights, particularly the Second Amendment. Others argue that enforcement will be inconsistent, targeting law-abiding citizens rather than criminals. Still, others warn that it could create a slippery slope toward further federal control over firearms. While these concerns are worthy of discussion, the Supreme Court's unanimous decision reinforces the legal validity of the ban. Federal law now supersedes any state-level attempts to contradict it. Avoiding compliance is not a strategy. It is a direct path to criminal liability. The court's ruling emphasizes that legal boundaries must be respected regardless of personal beliefs about firearms. Historically, the Second Amendment has been interpreted in diverse ways. The original text focused on the right of the people to maintain a well-regulated militia. Over time, legal interpretations expanded individual firearm rights, culminating in landmark cases such as District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, which recognized an individual's right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, including self-defense. The 1968 Gun Control Act and the 1994 assault weapons ban focused on regulating specific types of firearms deemed too dangerous for civilian ownership. Those bans either expired or were limited in scope, leaving enforcement gaps. The current ruling marks a departure from these precedents, representing the first time the Supreme Court has actively rewritten the boundaries of the Second Amendment regarding assault-style firearms. This legal shift will influence not only enforcement of the current law, but also the interpretation of future legislation for decades. The court's decision also highlights evolving federal authority over firearms. By unanimously supporting the ban, the judiciary signals that public safety concerns can outweigh traditional interpretations of individual rights when high-risk firearms are involved. This sets a precedent for future regulatory action and may encourage lawmakers to pursue additional measures aimed at reducing firearm-related violence. It is a clear indication that the federal government can regulate the possession and transfer of certain firearms, even against long-standing interpretations of constitutional rights. For citizens, this means that the landscape of legal ownership is changing, and adapting to these changes is essential for compliance and personal security. Looking forward, the implications are wide-ranging. Law-abiding citizens must review all firearms and ensure proper registration. Legal experts recommend consulting attorneys specializing in firearm law to navigate compliance requirements. Gun dealers and collectors must adjust operations immediately. The federal government will enforce penalties without exception, and the legal consequences of non-compliance are severe. Beyond enforcement, the ruling is likely to influence political debates, with future legislation potentially expanding federal control over firearms even further. Understanding these implications is critical not only for compliance, but for participating in the broader public discussion on firearm policy. In practical terms, the timeline for compliance is limited. 2026 is when enforcement begins, meaning that preparation, registration, and legal consultation should occur immediately. Law enforcement agencies have begun issuing guidelines, and federal prosecutors are actively preparing for enforcement operations. Citizens who fail to act face penalties that are both criminal and civil, including incarceration, fines, and permanent loss of firearm rights. The ruling does not discriminate between casual owners, collectors, or licensed dealers. All are subject to the same legal framework. Immediate awareness and proactive compliance are essential for avoiding severe consequences. Real-world scenarios underscore the stakes. Imagine a family in California who legally owns firearms for personal protection. Under the new law, certain rifles they own may be classified as assault weapons. Without proper registration, they could face federal prosecution. Similarly, gun enthusiasts in multiple states must now reassess ownership of semi-automatic rifles, magazines, and other accessories that meet the federal definition. Gun shops must verify inventory, adjust sales protocols, and ensure customers are aware of registration requirements. The ruling's reach is extensive, leaving no region or demographic unaffected. Ignorance of the law will not be tolerated, and federal authorities are prepared to enforce compliance nationwide. Public perception is also evolving. Some communities view the ban as necessary for public safety, while others see it as an infringement of constitutional rights. This tension underscores the broader debate over firearms in America. However, the Supreme Court's ruling is clear and legally binding. Regardless of opinion, federal enforcement will proceed according to the letter of the law. The decision represents a turning point, not just in legal interpretation, but in the national conversation on gun rights, public safety, and federal authority. Citizens and lawmakers alike must navigate this new reality with diligence and awareness. The unanimous ruling also provides clarity for future legal challenges. By establishing a strong precedent, the Supreme Court has signaled that similar legislation is likely to withstand constitutional scrutiny. Lawmakers may now pursue additional measures addressing high-risk firearms, and future courts will reference this decision in evaluating related cases. This legal foundation enhances the predictability of enforcement, ensuring that federal authorities have the tools necessary to implement the law consistently and effectively. Understanding the precedent set by this ruling is critical for anyone involved in firearm ownership, regulation, or legal advocacy. It is also essential to understand the consequences of noncompliance. Individuals who fail to register firearms classified as assault weapons may face criminal charges, including up to 10 years in prison and permanent loss of rights. Businesses that fail to adhere to federal regulations risk prosecution, fines, and potential closure. Legal counsel is highly recommended, as federal enforcement will not distinguish between willful violations and ignorance of the law. Compliance requires vigilance, awareness, and proactive action. Historical examples provide further context. Previous bans, such as the 1994 assault weapons ban, targeted specific firearm models and high-capacity magazines. When these bans expired, firearms previously restricted became legal again, and enforcement gaps emerged. The current Supreme Court ruling removes ambiguity, reclassifies firearms, and establishes enforcement authority across the entire nation. This is a landmark shift in American gun law, one that will likely define policy and enforcement for decades. Citizens must recognize the magnitude of this change and act accordingly. Political implications are also profound. Lawmakers, advocacy groups, and state governments will continue to debate the law's merits, its enforcement, and its impact on constitutional rights. However, the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling ensures that federal authority is paramount. State-level resistance may arise, but federal law now has legal supremacy. This creates a new landscape where federal enforcement is both legally supported and operationally mandated. Understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone seeking to navigate, comply with, or influence firearm policy. The ruling's long-term impact extends beyond immediate enforcement. By redefining the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court has set a precedent for interpreting constitutional rights in light of public safety concerns. This approach may influence legislation addressing other high-risk activities, providing a legal framework for balancing individual rights against societal interests. Citizens, lawmakers, and legal experts must recognize that the decision represents a shift not only in firearm policy, but in constitutional interpretation more broadly. In conclusion, the Supreme Court's unanimous decision rewriting Second Amendment rights and enforcing the 2026 assault weapons ban represents a pivotal moment in American legal history. Citizens must act immediately to comply with registration requirements, consult legal experts, and ensure that all firearms are classified and registered according to the new federal definitions. The penalties for noncompliance are severe, including imprisonment, fines, and permanent loss of rights. Lawmakers, dealers, and collectors must navigate a new legal landscape with diligence, awareness, and responsibility. The ruling is not speculation, it is enforceable law, and its consequences will be felt nationwide. Stay informed, review all firearms in your possession, consult with legal experts, and follow updates carefully. Knowledge is the first line of defense in this new era of firearm regulation. Subscribe, stay updated, and ensure that you understand the full scope of the law before 2026. Awareness, preparation, and compliance are now essential. The Supreme Court has acted. The law is clear. The responsibility is yours.